while American GDP per capita had grown by 8%. Canada's economy is now underperforming the U.S. by the widest margin since 1965, the worst per capita income drop in the G7 in the last 5 years. These are the consequences of inflationary spending, taxes, and deficits from this Liberal NDP government. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, none of this is a surprise to the people of Flamborough-Glanbrook because they're living it every day. And what angers them even more is it doesn't have to be this way in Canada. Generations have sought Canada for opportunity, hope, and freedom, and yet this Prime Minister has destroyed that. He is definitely not worth the cost. Only common sense Conservatives will fix the budget and axe the tax so Canadians can bring home powerful paychecks.
Now the honourable member from Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, music is an essential part of the human experience. It fills our lives with joy and comfort, and fundamentally, music unites us. And so today, I make this overture to congratulate Symphony Nova Scotia on their 40th anniversary. Throughout the years, Symphony Nova Scotia has embraced the full spectrum of genres, from classical to baroque to pop to jazz to spectacular collaborations with some of Canada's biggest stars. The Symphony also plays a vital role in nurturing creativity through educational initiatives, mentorship, and community programs. Their diverse and versatile repertoire and the skill with which they perform it has captivated our hearts for generations. So today, for its long-standing commitment to the cultural traditions that have shaped Nova Scotia over the last 40 years, we applaud Symphony Nova Scotia not from the music hall seats back home, but right here from the benches of the Parliament of Canada. Happy anniversary to the Symphony Nova Scotia, and may the next 40 years reprise the accomplishments and excitement of the last 40 years.
The honourable member from Willowdale.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay respects to the Honourable James Scott Peterson, my extraordinary predecessor as the Member of Parliament for Willowdale, who sadly passed away on May 10th. Jim Peterson was a distinguished lawyer, philanthropist, parliamentarian, and minister who won 6 federal elections and served as the Member of Parliament for Willowdale for 23 years. Yet what made him so incredibly memorable was not only his enviable number of years as a tireless parliamentarian, but his immense intellect and his exceptionally big heart. A larger-than-life personality, Jim was an inspiration to myself and many of the most discerning individuals that follow Canadian politics. On behalf of the many residents of Willowdale, I'd like to offer my condolences to his wife, Heather, his family, and his many, many friends. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Wonderful statement. Wonderful statement.
The honourable member for Beauport, Côte-de-Beaupré, Île d'Orléans, Charlevoix. When a country's statutory holidays are not celebrated for the same reasons everywhere, you have to ask yourself why. Yesterday in Quebec, we celebrated the memory of the patriotes who fought against the British Empire for our freedom at the very cost of their lives. Meanwhile, in Canada, some were celebrating the crown of the same British Empire that hanged them, and which, to this day, has never apologized for this act of colonial violence. Chevalier de Lorimier and his brothers-in-arms were on the right side of history, however, and what followed proved them right. In amongst other things, they demanded a government that was responsible and accountable to the people of Quebec. Quebec remembers its martyrs, and Canada continues to celebrate their executioners. When such a division exists within a country, it's because there are two countries. While this weekend saw the memory of the patriots scorned, let us remember that the best way to honour their sacrifice is to win. The patriots' fight is our fight. Our victory will be their victory. The honourable member for Orléans. Mr. Speaker, it is with a sense of pride and accomplishment that I share with this House that on the 2nd of May, the Minister for Official Languages travelled to Orléans to announce a federal government investment to the tune of $36 million for the construction of the new MIFO Centre. Since 1979, MIFO, a pillar of the Francophone community, has touched the lives of more than 100,000 Francophones. The revitalization of MIFO into a carbon-neutral building in the very heart of an official language minority community will help the Francophone and Francophile community of Orléans, Ottawa and Eastern Ontario to provide community services and spaces for all generations. Thank you to the local leaders and to my colleagues in the National Capital Region for all of your support. Mr. Speaker, we have our new centre for MIFO.
The honourable member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
May is Skin Awareness Month, and with summer underway, the Save Your Skin Foundation is using this time to increase awareness and promote treatment and prevention of skin cancer. My wife, Kelly, is a melanoma skin cancer survivor. Unfortunately, too many have lost their lives to this disease, while others continue to fight. It was projected that in 2023, 9,700 Canadians would be diagnosed with melanoma and 1,250 would die from it. Sadly, these numbers continue to rise year after year. Skin cancer is caused by overexposure to UV radiation from the sun and the use of artificial tanning equipment. In the past, I tabled a private member's bill that strengthened warning labels on artificial tanning equipment, which was enacted by our previous Conservative government. This summer, I encourage all Canadians to enjoy the great outdoors and be skin safe. The good news is that prevention is easy. Wear sunscreen, cover up when outside, seek shade, and avoid tanning beds, and of course, have lots of fun.
The honourable member from Mississauga Lakeshore.
I rise today to recognize the 100th anniversary of Port Credit Secondary School. As one of the oldest educational institutions in Ontario, the school has a rich history. It has survived the Great Depression, the Second World War, a devastating fire, and even a visit from our friend, Prime Minister Chrétien. The school's alumni have gone on to successful careers, raise families, and make significant contributions to our country. With academic excellence as its central mission, Port Credit Secondary continues to inspire the minds of the next generation. The school is a beacon of learning, helping to guide our young leaders in the pursuit of wisdom. Congratulations on this historic achievement. Here's to another 100 years, and as its motto goes, may the light never fail.
Bravo. The honourable member from Milton.
The Canadian sports broadcasting world has lost a giant. Born and raised in Porcupine Plains, Saskatchewan, Darren Dutchyshen was a mainstay on TSN Sports Centre for close to 30 years. He was in many ways the heartbeat of TSN. Dutchy loved sports. Dutchy loved Canada, and Dutchy loved his job at TSN. And no one was more passionate about bringing the sports highlights to Canadians every single night, and he always did it with a giant smile, his massive personality, and often inappropriate humor. Rod Smith and Jennifer Hedger and countless other Canadian broadcasting legends have shared moments that exemplified Dutchy's unforgettable personality and remarkable talent. It's been a tough time, but those memories have been very touching. Confident and kind, larger than life and always smiling, Darren Dutchyshen was a beauty. To his kids, Tyler, Brett, and Paige, and his partner, Kate, to his TSN family and all of his fans, I want to extend deepest condolences and express our sincerest gratitude for all the amazing stories told by Dutch, all the laughs and highlights. Dutchy, you left an indelible mark on the Canadian sports narrative, and we'll never forget you.
The honourable member from Brantford Brant.
After 9 years, this Liberal government is not worth the cost or the corruption. While Canadians struggle with a cost of living crisis, the Liberals dish out billions to government contractors for their Arrive scam. Last week revealed more corruption. Another lavish dinner between GC Strategies, the two-person IT company paid $20 million for doing no work, and government officials. The head of this two-person operation had their house raided by the RCMP in their investigation into the Arrive scam. On top of this Liberal mismanagement and waste, we learned that the former CBSA chief, John Osowski, was given a one-day contract for $500 so that he could access documents to prepare him for a committee appearance. All the while, he was working for a consulting firm that does business with the Government of Canada. Another glaring conflict of interest and waste of taxpayer money. This incompetent Liberal government is a burden Canadians cannot afford. Conservatives will use every measure possible to bring home accountability for Canadian tax dollars and put a stop to corruption.
Then I have Député, the honourable member from London West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to celebrate the rich heritage, diversity, and resilience of the African continent ahead of the Africa Day on May 25th. As a member of this private community, I understand the importance of fostering strong ties between Canada and Africa. Africa Day serves as a reminder for our shared history and the ongoing journey towards unity, progress, and prosperity for all African nations, and as well as the African diaspora, including the 1.3 million African Canadians. It is a day to honor the struggles and the sacrifices of those who fought for liberation, justice, and equality, both in Africa and in communities across our country. Canada's relationship with Africa is essential for promoting peace, sustainable development, and mutual prosperity. Through collaborations, areas such as trade, diplomacy, and life-saving healthcare investments, including Gavi and IDA, Canada and African nations can work together to address common challenges and seize the opportunities for growth and innovation. Together, we can build bridges of understanding and cooperation that benefit both our nations and contribute to a brighter future for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, our nation is gripped in an opioid crisis, with over 42,000 Canadians dying from overdose since 2016. Yet this Prime Minister still allowed hard drugs like cocaine, meth, and heroin to be used in public spaces in my province of British Columbia. Our once safe hospitals are being destroyed by these radical drug policies. The BC Nurses Union is ringing the alarm bell, saying that vulnerable patients and staff are being exposed to illegal drugs, harmful weapons, and increased violence. Common sense conservatives will not allow this catastrophic experiment to come to the rest of Canada. Our Safe Hospitals Act will put the brakes on the insanity, punishing criminals who bring dangerous weapons, violence, and illicit drugs into our hospitals. We will immediately pass my common sense bill C-321, which will protect first responders and healthcare workers from increased violence they face while serving our communities. A common sense conservative government will ban hard drugs and taxpayer-funded opioid handouts. Instead, invest in compassionate treatment and recovery for our loved ones.
Then I have
The honourable member for Charlesbourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Many Quebec families have had to cancel their summer vacation because Liberal taxes with block assistance have made it unaffordable. Some people find it hard to buy food, so they can't even start thinking about going on vacation. The Prime Minister is going on vacation, a luxury vacation, but at the same time, Quebecers are having to cancel theirs. We are asking the Prime Minister to offer respite to Quebecers by removing all new taxes, including the carbon tax, so that people can just go on holiday. This would allow families to save hundreds of dollars. For those and Quebecers who want to visit the Maritimes or Ontario, the Conservatives will cut taxes for everyone in the next elections. Will the Prime Minister adopt this measure to offer a summer boost for Quebec families? The honourable member for Argenteuil-la-Petite-Nation.
the honourable member from Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Mr. Speaker, last week I joined the Health Committee during its 2 days in Vancouver as a part of its study into toxic drug crisis. We met with people on the front lines, supervised consumption sites, overdose prevention, low barrier housing, healthcare and recovery providers, law enforcement, and the community court. We also met directly with people who use drugs, the very same who are bearing the terrible and lethal impact of toxic street drugs. I learned a lot over those 2 days, especially about harm reduction and safe supply as necessary parts of a continuum of care with treatment and recovery. Unfortunately and shamefully, not one single Conservative MP showed up in Vancouver. Shame. Rather than learn and bear witness to evidence-informed policies on the toxic drug crisis, the Conservatives would rather embrace bumper sticker politics, false narratives, and scapegoat the most vulnerable. The Liberal government has failed to meet this crisis with the urgency it demands, and the Conservatives are playing politics, all the while people die.
The honourable member for Bailleul-Chambly. I often tell my colleagues from Jonquière and Lac-Saint-Jean we should talk to Claude. I'm talking about the biologist, Claude Villeneuve, who was a giant every single day and a giant in science. He passed away on Sunday evening. A scientist and a professor for whom ideology did not replace science. University was for research, the creation of knowledge that was then put towards the common good. Claude said that he was less skilled than he actually was. It was easy to get him to speak, but sometimes it took him a while to stop speaking. In 2003, he founded the Chair in Eco Consultancy. He started the Carbone Boreal system. The international scene is losing a researcher whose tools were even incorporated into the UN in 2017. Claude complimented us in his last week, saying, "I'm pleased to present my project because I know that with you, it will get done." What a compliment, Claude. But you left us far too soon.
The honourable member from Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Speaker, fun fact, this Liberal NDP minority government is now the longest serving minority government in this country's history. Not so fun fact, Canadians have never been poorer, with the worst standard of living crisis in 40 years. And in the middle of this historic cost of living crisis, this government decided to hike the carbon tax 23%, ruining Canadians' vacations. Conservatives just announced their common sense plan to axe the carbon tax and all federal taxes on gas from Victoria Day to Labor Day weekend, saving the average Canadian 35 cents, or for those in Ontario, $592. Common sense Conservatives know that what Canadians really need a vacation from is this government and their tax hikes, which is why when Canadians elect a Conservative government, we will axe the tax in the summer, in the fall, in the winter, forever, for everyone.
The honourable member from Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and recognize Nick Green, a constituent of Malpeque and an island beef producer that is in Ottawa today with maritime beef producers for their annual Hill Day. Last year, Nick and his operation Kingsview Farms earned the Maritime Beef Council's 2023 Environmental Stewardship Award for his commitment to sustainability in agriculture. Nick is a third generation on the family farm, which was first established in the early 1900s. When he fully took over the operation in 2019, he set out to improve efficiency while benefiting from the environment and reducing input costs. Through a series of operational changes that relied on conservation and regenerative farming practices, like a closely managed rotational grazing system and late spring calving, Nick has managed to achieve his goals. He's now on track to achieve a 75% reduction in fertilizer and chemical costs and 50% reduction in diesel fuel costs by 2025. Nick, congratulations, and thanks for being a leader in your industry.
Oral questions. Questions à l'honorable.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. After 9 years of this Prime Minister, they're not worth the cost. Taxes and inflationary deficits are piling up, and even worse, the Bloc and the Liberals want to radically hike taxes on gasoline and diesel. When 25 countries have cut gas taxes and Western provinces have cut tax and were able to bring down prices at the pumps and lower inflation in terms of other provinces, how come the PM cannot follow my common sense plan to eliminate taxes until Labor Day? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I'm so happy that the Conservative leader raised the question of inflation, because it gives me the opportunity today to share great news with Canadians. It's that our inflation rate dropped to 2.7%. This is the lowest level in 3 years, and it's thanks to our responsible plan for the budget. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Learned the terrible news that inflation is 35% above target. Again, and after 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost of debt interest. And they can't do basic math over there. The 0.7 is actually a third higher than the 2% target. They're patting themselves on the back when they realize that Canadians can't afford to eat, heat, and house themselves. So why don't they, instead of quadrupling the carbon tax on the backs of Canadians, why don't they follow our common sense plan to suspend all gas and diesel tax until Labor Day?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader has quite proudly and publicly called for the Governor of the Bank of Canada to be fired. But maybe it's the Conservative leader who should lose his job because he just revealed his astonishing ignorance of the Bank of Canada's inflation target. The Bank of Canada has a target of between 1% and 3%, and for 4 months in a row, inflation in Canada has been within that target.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The minister doesn't even know that the target is 2%, and perhaps one of the reasons why she's missing the target because she doesn't know what it is. It's the same thing with interest rates that we're paying on national debt. They've said that doubling national debt is an issue because the interest rates were so low. That's why I suggested setting the rate with 10 or 30 years with bond rates when the rates were so low, like we do with mortgages. But the incompetent minister did not do this, and now we're going to pay more interest on the $400 billion that will be renewed this year. Why? The Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that the Conservative leader is very incompetent. The only thing that he plans to do, rather, is to criticize Canada and Canadians, to criticize our wonderful country. The reality is that the inflation rate is down to 2.7%. This is very successful for our country, and all members should be happy with this. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Not only does the incompetent finance minister not know the inflation target, she doesn't know that you lock in low rates when you have the chance. Remember, the Prime Minister was saying, don't worry, we can double the national debt because interest rates are low. Yep. Glenn, problem is, I told him at the time that they should lock in those rates for 10 years or 30 years with long-term bonds. It turns out they didn't do that, and now $400 billion of that debt will roll over into these higher rates, forcing Canadians to spend more on interest than on health care. Why did he hire the worst mortgage broker in the world to be our finance minister?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
The Conservative leader is in a grouchy mood today. And I think we all know why. The only thing he knows how to do is talk down Canada. And what he just cannot bear is the reality that thanks to our fiscally responsible economic plan, inflation is at a 3-year low. That's right. Inflation has been within the Bank of Canada range for 4 months in a row. That's good news for Canada and Canadians. That's right.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Think that you pay down debt by borrowing more, that you stop inflation by printing money, and that you fight the drug overdose crisis by legalizing hard drugs. So at least they're consistent in their irrationality, Mr. Speaker. But now they've been forced to backtrack right before the election on their legalization of hard drugs because Canadians are revolting against the policy. Today we have a motion that will be voted in the House to permanently ban hard drugs. Will this government vote for that motion, or will they admit that they plan to legalize drugs again after the next election?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader is wearing more makeup than I am today. Now, I think it's wonderful.
I'm going to ask colleagues. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance to withdraw that comment. We don't comment on the appearances of members. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, I withdraw that comment.
can continue with her. She has 25 seconds left on the clock for her answer.
The fact is, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader is phony all the way through. He is phony when it comes to his concern about the economy. All he can do is talk our country down. And he is phony when he talks about his concern about the opioids crisis. He tries to score cheap partisan points. It's just not right, Mr. Speaker. That's right.
The honourable member for Saint-Jean. It looks like the Liberals have just discovered they're sensitive to the Francophonie cause. The Association Parlementaire de la Francophonie had 18 Liberals in 2021, 11 in 2022, and 22 in 2023. And then since last week, a sudden realization there are no fewer than 112 members of the Liberal caucus that are now members of the APF. Congratulations, Francophiles, thank you. What an extraordinary commitment to the French language. But can we find out what the Liberals' priority issue is at the APF that explains this sudden commitment on their part? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I would truly like to thank the member across the way for her question, because our government and myself personally understand that the French has taken a step back in Montreal, in Quebec, and across the country. But I have to tell the member that I don't find this situation funny. It's not a joke. The Quebec nation is so important for us, as is the French language. The honourable member for Saint-Jean. If they didn't decide to stack the APF, it's not because they've had a sudden epiphany and they realize that French is under threat in Quebec and Canada and around the world. No, they signed up because nothing is more important to a Liberal than another Liberal. They have to stick together. They're there because they need to stave their friend from Glengarry, Prescott Russell, and then we'll never see them again. It might be a good idea for this government to work in the interests of the French language as hard as it works in the interests of the Liberals. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, the French language in Montreal, in Quebec, and across Canada is very important for our government. We understand that there has been a decline in French, and we are going to always support the French language and Quebec culture and French culture across Canada.
The honourable member from Burnaby South.
The Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is seeking arrest warrants against 5 senior Hamas and Israeli leaders. This is a step towards justice for Palestinians and Israeli victims of war crimes. And the Liberals promised to support the ICC when they voted for our motion in March. So will the Prime Minister and the Liberal government state clearly that Canada supports the ICC's work to hold all those responsible for crimes accountable?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Canada respects the independence of the International Criminal Court. Canada condemns the terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel on October 7th. Canada calls for an immediate ceasefire and deplores the humanitarian tragedy. And Canada believes it is absolutely wrong to equate the terrorist leaders of Hamas with Israel.
The
honourable member for Burnaby South.
And that was not the subject of the arrest warrant.
The chief prosecutor of the ICC has requested arrest warrants for 5 senior Israeli and Hamas officials. This is an important step towards justice for Palestinian and Israeli victims. Can the Prime Minister clearly state that Canada will support the work of the ICC to hold all those responsible for crimes accountable? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker. Canada respects the independence of the International Criminal Court. Canada condemns the October 7 attack, which was a terrorist attack. Canada is calling for an immediate ceasefire, and Canada says that it is not right to equate the Hamas terrorist leader and Israel.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, it is clear the Prime Minister is not worth the cost of fuel. Most Canadian families will struggle just to be able to afford their yearly summer road trip. That's because his carbon tax has helped push the cost of fuel up to record highs. Now, Conservatives have called for a common sense plan to axe the carbon tax and all federal taxes from fuel from now until Labor Day. That would save about 35 cents a litre. Will the government adopt our common sense plan so Canadians can afford their summer road trip?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm so glad that the Conservatives are raising questions about the cost of living and the lives of Canadians, because it gives me an opportunity to point out that inflation in April was 2.7%. That is the fourth month in a row that inflation has been within the Bank of Canada's target range. And for 15 months now, Mr. Speaker, wage increases have been outpacing inflation. That helps Canadians.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
That's the Liberal message, that Canadians have never had it so good. The carbon tax is failing, except at driving up the cost of everything. Actually, the government is succeeding very, very well at driving up the cost of groceries, home heating, and, of course, fuel. The carbon tax is sending millions of Canadians to the food bank for the first time, and it's pushing the cost of simple things like driving to your favorite family vacation spot out of the reach of hardworking Canadians. While the Prime Minister gets to stick Canadian taxpayers with the bill for his exotic vacations, Canadians are struggling just to scrape enough to take their family on a trip. Why won't they adopt our plan and take the tax off of fuel for the summer?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage my honourable friend to actually read the work that was done by 300 economists across this country, which says unequivocally that 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back in the rebate than they actually pay in the price on pollution. That is addressing affordability, and in fact, Premier Smith herself said she got more money back for her family than she paid. If he really is concerned about affordability, though, I would encourage him to go to talk to his friend Premier Smith, who just increased the gas price by 13 cents, and did so with no rebate and no accounting for affordability.
The honourable member from Lakeland.
After 9 years, Canadians can't afford the costly coalition's carbon tax, but this Prime Minister doesn't care. He'll quadruple it, even though 70% of Canadians and 7 out of 10 premiers told him to spike the hike. Now, Conservatives' common sense plan is to axe all federal taxes on gas until Labor Day to save Canadians 35 cents a litre. That's more than $955 of needed savings for Alberta families alone. Will the Prime Minister axe the tax on gas this summer so Canadians can afford the basics and maybe even a Canadian road trip staycation?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives' lack of common sense approach to these things is about axing the facts. Every reasonable observer, 300 economists across this country, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, are very clear. 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back, and it's those that live on modest incomes that actually do the best, all the while fighting climate change. If they have questions, I encourage them to go and talk to the Premier of their province of Alberta about the fact that she gets more money back than she actually pays. That is a responsible plan to address affordability and to fight climate change.
The honourable member from Lakeland.
Well, after 9 years, it's clear that everyone but these out-of-touch elite NDP Liberals knows the carbon tax isn't worth the cost. Page 4 of last year's budget officer report says, quote, maybe you should listen, taking into consideration fiscal and economic impacts, most households will see a net loss. The NDP Liberals' inflationary tax and spend agenda makes everything more expensive and hurts vulnerable Canadians. The most common sense Conservatives will axe the tax for all for good, but since fuel prices have surged over 50% under him, will the PM at least axe the tax on Canadian summer road trips?
The Honourable Minister for Energy and Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, it is very clear. 300 economists across this country agree. 8 out of 10 Canadians get more money back in the rebate. It is an approach that addresses affordability, does so in a manner that actually addresses climate change. Mr. Speaker, I would encourage my honourable colleague across the way to talk to her Premier, who has said it is a price on pollution that actually gives her family more money back, and she should go and have a conversation with Premier Smith, who just raised the price on gasoline by 13 cents with no rebate and no plan to address the climate crisis.
The honourable member from Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, our jet-setting Prime Minister has begun his summery luxury tour early, blowing through Philadelphia with his usual all-expenses-paid 5-star hotels and all the food and alcohol his entourage can take. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, most Canadians can hardly afford a summer road trip. Will he adopt our common-sense plan to put $682 in the pockets of British Columbians and give them a shot at a summer road trip, or is he planning on putting himself first?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Once again, I would encourage my honourable colleagues across the way to stop misleading people with respect to the price on pollution. They need to look and read the letter that was written by 300 economists across this country that say the carbon price is the most economically efficient way to address climate in a manner that actually addresses affordability for Canadians. I would encourage them to go to talk to their friend Premier Smith, who said exactly that. Her family got more money back than they actually paid in the price on pollution. And I would encourage them, if they're concerned about the price of gas, go talk to Premier Smith and ask her to reduce it by 13 cents that she just raised it with no rebate whatsoever.
The honourable member from Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.
That rhetoric won't put money in the back pocket of British Columbians. And while the cost of this jet-setting Prime Minister summer luxury tours and vacation soars, his carbon taxes and gas taxes are driving Canadians nose first into the ground. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Canadians are struggling to afford a simple road trip. Our Conservative common sense plan to give $682 back to the people of British Columbia, will the Prime Minister agree that his carbon tax is a road trip wrecker and axe the tax on gas this summer?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I am really astonished by the gall of these Conservatives who have the temerity to talk about the road trips of regular Canadians when they racked up $426,283 of the money of Canadians traveling to their own convention. The member for Central Okanagan was one of the Conservatives who charged regular Canadians to go to his convention. That is not right, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Lac Saint Jean. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Immigration has finally met with his counterparts from Quebec, the provinces and the territories, and they have finally addressed the issue of reception capacity. The solution, a working committee. A working committee to examine the distribution of asylum seekers. It doesn't seem to me that this wasn't a problem for the Minister. It seems to me that when we asked for a more equitable distribution, he told us that asylum seekers are not cattle. Are we to understand that nothing will change between now and the committee's recommendation on the ground? The Honourable Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. if he'd like to criticize the working committee, perhaps he should also criticize the government of Quebec because they proposed it, and with the other provinces we said yes. He wasn't at the meeting 8 days ago. We did agree in a communique that we work together unanimously and coordinate our efforts because we know that asylum seekers do need to be welcomed in Quebec, and we can do this in coordination with all provinces. The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. I would ask if he invites me next time, I'll be there. Quebec is asking to be reimbursed for $1 billion for the cost of welcoming asylum seekers. Quebec is just asking the cost be shared with other provinces so that they're doing their fair share. Quebec is calling for a reduction in temporary immigration and power to approve all applicants and calling for French language requirements. And what did the immigration minister offer Quebecers after months of shirking his responsibilities? A committee. Is there even a deadline for this committee to start delivering results? The Honourable Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. What we don't invite to these meetings are quarrels, Mr. Speaker. We want to work together, and our communique was unanimous for once with Quebec. And in terms of French training, we've set aside around $5 billion since 2015. We want to make sure once again that French is strengthened in Quebec. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. At the end of the meeting, the Minister of Immigration said that the status quo was no longer acceptable. But as we speak, it is still the status quo. Nothing has changed on the ground. And as we speak, the federal government hasn't paid Quebec back 1 cent. And Quebec still receives more than half of all asylum seekers in Canada. This committee mustn't be allowed to become a toy to buy time until the election. It needed results yesterday, and it's even more urgent today. So when are results due? The Honourable Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Mr. Speaker, the status quo is the bloc which has done nothing for 30 years. Even though we have given billions to Quebec for French training, those are the results they've achieved.
The Honourable Member from Hastings, Lennox-Naddington.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 summers, Canadians know this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. His carbon tax has hiked up the price of everything. Canadians deserve relief, not taxes. Unlike this coalition of convenience, Conservatives have a solution. Cancel all federal tax on gas from now until Labor Day, keeping nearly $600 in the bank accounts of Ontarians to spend on basic needs and maybe even visit with family. Mr. Speaker, would it be too much to ask for the Prime Minister to lend a helping hand to Canadians and take the tax off their summer road trips?
Yeah.
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I'm curious if the honourable members actually approach Conservative premiers across Canada who maintain their own taxes on fuel. Mr. Speaker, in particular, in the province of Alberta, Danielle Smith has increased the price of fuel by 13 cents and offers no rebate. I expect she knows very well that the majority of families receive more than they actually pay in a fuel tax, but facts don't seem to matter to a party who is committed to eroding all of the environmental protections that exist in this country and have virtually no plans to invest in the things that are going to help working-class families address the cost of living. We're in search of solutions, not fights. I wish they'd at least come armed with facts.
The Honourable Member from South Shore St. Margaret's.
Conservatives are calling on the NDP Liberals to axe the carbon tax and all federal taxes on gas from Victoria Day to Labor Day. For Nova Scotians, this represents $542 of savings per family this summer. After 9 years, we know the Prime Minister will jet off to surf in Tofino this summer at taxpayers' expenses while Nova Scotians can't afford a summer road trip.
That's right.
Will the Prime Minister do a surfing cutback to help Canadians by taking the tax off the summer road trip?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, I know the Conservatives are excited. They think they found a new bumper sticker to put. But what would they say to that family? Not only are they taking away their carbon rebate, they also would be taking away child care. They'd be taking away their dental care. They'd be taking away their diabetes medication. So what they'd say in exchange for taking all of those things away from vulnerable people is to say that a false, empty promise. And that's what we have on the other side. Empty rhetoric and really attacking vulnerable people at a time time when they most need help. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to stand with those who need help.
The honourable member from Brandon-Souris.
Speaker, after 9 years, Canadians can't afford this NDP Liberal government's carbon tax that they just increased by 23%. That's why Conservatives announced a common sense plan to axe the carbon tax and all federal taxes on gas from Victoria Day to Labor Day.
Great idea.
It's a 35-cent per litre saving, Mr. Speaker. In Manitoba, this would represent over $600 in savings for each family during this summer. So will the Prime Minister lend a helping hand to Canadians and take the tax off their summer road trip?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was actually just in Manitoba last week where we were announcing supports for Canadian families, Mr. Speaker. More investments in creating more childcare spaces to relieve the burden for families. These are programs that we continue to invest in. The Canada Child Benefit, the dental plan, excuse me, Mr. Speaker. Investments in Canadians, well, we see the Conservatives continue to vote against, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from King Vaughan.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, people can't afford to live or die. Funeral costs are now out of reach for Canadians in Ontario. The increase in unclaimed bodies is 488% since 2013. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Seniors are already struggling with affordability crisis. They have built this country, and now they can't afford to bid their loved ones farewell. When will this Prime Minister show some compassion and stop the out-of-control spending so people can live and die with dignity?
The Honourable Minister for Health.
Well, Mr. Speaker, for somebody to live with dignity, they need access to dental care. For somebody to live with dignity, they need access to their diabetes medication. For somebody to live with dignity, they need access to the medicine and support and health care that we're making sure we deliver each and every day. And for the party opposite, the Conservatives, to say the solution to global inflation and the crisis that people are seeing all over the world is to slash supports to vulnerable peoples, to attack the very supports that lift them up in the darkest times that we've faced in generations. We say no. We will continue to be there for Canadians and make sure they get what they need.
The honourable member for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 years, the cost of the grocery basket has gone up by 21%. Food banks are incredibly full, but the Liberals and Conservatives are doing nothing. The CEO of Metro is a Conservative donor. We know who the leader of the opposition is really working for, and the Liberals are giving millions of dollars to Loblaw and Costco. People are hungry, and meanwhile, the CEOs are getting the VIP treatment. Enough is enough. Will the Liberals support our motion to ensure that CEOs pay their fair share? Yes or no? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, we have an economic plan for fairness for each generation and for each Canadian. Mr. Speaker, we know that in order to fund that plan in a fiscally accountable manner, we need to ask the wealthiest to pay a little more. And that's what our government is doing. So my question is for the Conservatives who oppose our plan. They are the ones who are against a fair plan.
The honourable member from Vancouver, Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are hungry and hurting. Liberals have failed to lower food prices while Conservatives promote corporate greed. Yeah. Over the last 3 years, grocery prices increased 21% while portions shrink. In 2023 alone, grocery giants made a record $6 billion in profit, all while Canadian families are tightening their belts and missing meals. That's why today New Democrats are forcing Liberals to take a stand. Will they support our motion to make CEOs pay what they owe or continue to put profits over people like the Conservatives do?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, our government has put forward a plan for fairness for every generation, a plan to invest in housing, in affordability, in economic growth. And we've done it in a fiscally responsible way because we know inflation has to come down so interest rates can come down. To do that, Mr. Speaker, we are asking those who are the most successful in our amazing country to contribute a little bit more. That's tax fairness, Mr. Speaker. We support it. The party that opposes it is the Conservatives.
That's right. Good job.
L'honorable député de Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle.
Mr. Speaker, 8 out of 10 Canadians support a woman's right to choose. Yet, it seems the Conservative leader is unwilling to assure Canadians that he and his party will defend this fundamental right. Could the Minister of Women and Gender Equality and Youth remind the House of our government's position on a woman's right to choose? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister for Women and Gender Equality.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for her advocacy and her tireless work. I am proud to stand in this House to tell Canadians our government will always defend and support a woman's right to choose. Conservatives claim this is settled, yet anti-choice bills and petitions keep cropping up. Mr. Speaker, it is settled for us. No ifs, no buts, or maybes. We will never stop defending the rights women in this country have fought so hard for. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Well, Mr. Speaker, July 1st is going to be a disaster for people looking for housing in Quebec. We know that new housing construction has gone down in Montreal for both collective and individual housing year over year. We see that this Prime Minister's strategy is just another in a long list of failures. Will the Prime Minister do something about the obstacles that are preventing new home construction in Quebec? The Honourable Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting because the colleague who asked the question does not have a plan to address the situation. We have a plan to make the necessary investments to construct housing. For example, Mr. Speaker, we've signed an agreement with Quebec to build 8,000 new units of affordable housing.
Leader of the opposition, when he was housing minister, was only able to build 6 units across the entire country. They're going to cut the programs for housing. We're going to make the investments. There is not a clearer contrast.
L'honorable député de Charlebourg.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, what the minister should remember is that over the last 9 years, this government, with its friends in the Bloc Québécois, created the conditions that has made the cost of living so high today, along with interest rates and inflation. $500 billion in inflationary spending was voted for by this government and the Bloc Québécois. And that's why Canadians and Quebecers today don't have enough housing or just can't access it because it's too expensive. So can I get an intelligent answer to my question? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We see that sometimes memory can be quite short. My colleague seems to have forgotten that the Leader of the Opposition, when he was Minister of Housing, only built 6 units of affordable housing throughout the whole country during his entire term. 6. Whereas just in Charlebourg-Saint-Charles, my colleague's writing, 222 units of affordable housing were built over the last 2 months, thanks to the financial support of the Quebec and federal governments. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal government, we see that this Liberal party is not worth the costs, and Canadians are paying the cost. We're seeing now that rent has doubled with these Liberals in power, and people in Quebec are very worried because they know that there's going to be a crisis on July 1st. In Le Soleil, Nicole Dion, the coordinator of a housing organization, is saying that starting in mid-May, people are starting to panic because they may not be able to find housing and will end up in the streets. What does this government have to say to people who won't be able to find decent housing? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madame Dion is quite right. And she would be very shocked to hear that the leader of the opposition only created 6 units of affordable housing when he was Minister of Housing throughout the country during his entire term. Not 6 just for Quebec. 6 units of affordable housing throughout the entire country. Now, in my esteemed colleague's riding, Louise Saint-Laurent, we have built hundreds of units of affordable housing just in the last few months, thanks to the leadership of Quebec municipalities, which my Conservative colleagues like to call incompetent. Mr. Speaker, it's really unfortunate to see that my colleague from Quebec is continuing to engage in this kind of partisan mudslinging. I don't think Madame Dion would actually be in favor of what he just said. We know that people are suffering in Quebec. We know that 815 people asked for help from the CMHC. Would this minister like to go see them and talk to them about this kind of ridiculous point? The Honourable Minister of Procurement. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would be very pleased to go visit the 160 affordable housing units that were built in my colleague's riding. But the problem is that his Conservative leader is accusing Quebec municipalities of being incompetent. And yet, currently, in Quebec City, hundreds of units of affordable housing are being built thanks to Quebec City's municipal leadership with the funding from the federal government. So instead of boasting about these 6 meager affordable housing units that the Conservative leader built, well, we are working constructively with everyone involved.
Honorable député de Jonquière.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, the government has brought in a gag order to implement the budget, but this is a budget that's all about interfering in Quebec jurisdiction. It's all about making decisions on behalf of Quebecers, forcing strings onto Quebec and its cities to cut housing, or saying that housing will be cut if the conditions aren't met. It's intruding into the area of health. It's taking over all sorts of powers in the financial sector. It's almost as if the Liberals were a bit into separatism. Because once again, we're seeing this budget attacking Canadian federalism. Why not cooperate with Quebec instead of picking fights here? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Well, I'm very surprised to hear my colleague worrying about federalism, and I'm glad he cares about Canada. We also care about Canada. We've brought in programs that matter for all Canadians. And in fact, the Bloc Québécois should be ashamed because they, during the campaign, said that they would be working for the environment, for seniors, families, and for housing, and they voted against all of that. They should be ashamed. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Well, I will say that I don't care very much about federalism, but I do know that Quebecers want to be masters in their own home. But instead, in this budget, this federal government is trying to be the master of everything. The Liberals are trying to step in instead and do things that the provinces ought to deal with. But meanwhile, no one is keeping an eye on the federal government's jurisdiction. For example, no one is helping people between 65 and 75 who are not getting an increase in OAS. No one is helping with EI. No one is dealing with asylum. No one is helping in key sectors like forestry or aerospace. So instead of trying to just do everything on behalf of the provinces, why don't the Liberals actually deal with their own business? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you who's taking care of our seniors, the Liberal government. I'll tell you who's helping with housing, the Liberal government. Who's taking care of our youth, the Liberal government. Who's taking care of climate change and the environment, this Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. Meanwhile, the Bloc Québécois does one thing and one thing only. Pick fights, Mr. Speaker. They've lost sight of their moral compass. They don't even know why they're here. And at the risk of repeating myself, I would say that originally these people were here because they cared and they had passion, but today they're only still here for their pension.
À l'ordre, j'invite tous les collègues.
I would invite all of our colleagues to be very prudent in how they use language.
South Surrey, White Rock.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister and his extremist agenda, once safe BC hospitals are now infested with chaos, drugs, and weapons. The BC Nurses Union confirms staff are exposed to fentanyl and meth smoke. Even in maternity units, this is wacko. That's why I will introduce the Safe Hospitals Act that will toughen penalties for criminals who bring in weapons and ban the minister for allowing open hard drug use in hospitals. Will the Prime Minister support our common sense Conservative plan, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, in the first order, Mr. Speaker, if we're going to have safe hospitals, we have to provide science-based, evidence-based information and not support misinformation, because too often in our hospitals it is actually misinformation that is fueling much of the aggression that our doctors and nurses is facing. And secondly, I would say to the member opposite, the Health Committee going and listening to people on the ground in British Columbia and hearing directly from those affected by this toxic drug crisis. Why were the Conservatives not there? Why did they not send anybody to listen? Why are they not actually on the ground listening to those people who are suffering in this crisis? It's time to act on solutions and evidence, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from South Surrey, White Rock.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it'll be news to the BC Nurses Union that they're spreading disinformation. Here's the reality. Nurses should never be exposed to fentanyl smoke in their workplace. Patients should not have to worry about dangerous weapons when they're vulnerable, seeking treatment in hospitals. After 9 years, I can't believe I even have to ask this. Does the Prime Minister support tougher sentences for criminals who bring weapons into hospitals? And will he make it permanently illegal to smoke meth in hospital rooms next to newborn babies? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, of course, the only thing that separates the member opposite and her concern for victims and for families is that I and my colleagues here on this side of the House want to use evidence-based solutions to make sure that we respond to the crisis with things that are working. The reality is the strategy the member is advocating was first led by Newt Gingrich in the United States. It was the greatest disaster of his career. He has completely abdicated any responsibility for it, saying that it was a disastrous mistake. Stephen Harper's only actual advisors are saying the same thing. What they're advocating wouldn't work, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Cumberland Colchester.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal coalition, Canadians are suffering with crime, chaos, drugs, and disorder. The minister talks about evidence. What about the evidence from the BC Nurses Union and their outcry to ban weapons and hard drugs inside of hospitals? What more science could there be than that, Speaker? On this side of the House, Conservatives announced our plan for tough penalties for weapons in hospitals and to not allow the minister to decriminalize or even legalize hard drugs. Why do we have to ask again, will the Prime Minister make it illegal to smoke crack and meth in a hospital next to a baby?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, I find it disappointing that the member across actually did not join the recent visit by the Health Committee to BC to speak to experts on the ground. Actual member of the committee, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we follow science, we follow medical experts, we follow best evidence-based practices in order to save lives. The war on drugs didn't work then, it will not work now. We need compassion, evidence, and science to guide us through this.
L'honorable député de Sudbury.
The Honourable Member for Sudbury. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives voted against our Medicare legislation, which describes our government's plan to provide Canadians with free medication. This bill represents an important step forward to ensure that Canadians all have access to free reproductive choices and that no one will have to ration insulin anymore. Can the Minister of Health tell us about the positive effects of this bill for Canadians? The Honourable Minister of Health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for her important work on this issue. We share her objective of ensuring that everyone in the country will be able to access the medication they need. That is absolutely essential. I have a simple question. For almost all of the members of the Conservative Party who are against this legislation, why are these members against access to contraceptives? I can only think that these members are against women's rights generally.
Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Island, and Rideau Lakes.
Last week, we learned that 3 contractors involved in this Prime Minister's $60 million Arrive scam alone were awarded $1 billion. After 9 years, we know that this Prime Minister isn't worth that cost. But let's also talk about the corruption. One of those contractors who received $20 million in IT contracts but did no IT work had their doors kicked in by the RCMP. But what we also learned is that they were wining and dining senior officials from this very government. So we know that it cost $60 million. How many boozy dinners were involved in this $60 million scandal?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend knows very well that there are internal investigations taking place with respect to this matter. A number of people were properly called before parliamentary committees and came to testify. And of course, he also knows that the RCMP are looking into this matter. He made reference to that in an overly dramatic moment as well. So, Mr. Speaker, he should have the decency to let the police do their work. We've said from the beginning, anybody who misused taxpayers' money will be held to account, and I have confidence that the RCMP will do their work.
Absolutely.
The honourable member from St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, the ad hoc committee concluded that the Prime Minister went to unprecedented lengths to hide the Winnipeg lab documents from Parliament to protect his government from political embarrassment. In other words, a cover-up. And the cover-up continues. Last week, Liberal and NDP MPs voted to shut down a parliamentary committee to get to the bottom of the cover-up. A cover-up of a cover-up by the cover-up coalition. A simple question, what are they hiding?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the Honourable Member across would be aware that his party was against any of the mechanisms that actually brought these documents to light. It was this government, in fact, I was the House Leader at the time, that made sure that we had an ad hoc process to make sure that there was a way to properly vet secure documents. And that's why these documents in full, unredacted, are available for everybody to see. Now, the Conservatives refuse to participate in that, and they continue to search for some way to pretend those documents aren't available. But to any Canadian, not just any parliamentarian who wants to see those documents, they are available in their entirety.
L'honorable député de Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier.
The honourable member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are defending something unacceptable. The member for Glengarry Prescott Russell used vulgar and aggressive language towards Quebec witnesses who were defending the French language before a committee on May 6th. The member must be punished. He has tarnished the reputation of the committee and all its members. But of course, for the Liberals, a buddy is a buddy. They'd do anything to defend one of their own. Will the Prime Minister listen to reason and finally respect Francophones by removing the member from the Standing Committee on Official Languages and replacing him as head of the International Association Parlementaire de la Francophonie? The Honourable Government House Leader. Well, Mr. Speaker, the member for Glengarry Prescott Russell has spent a great deal of time in this Parliament defending French in Canada, much more than any member from the Conservative Party, in fact. We will continue to stand up for the French language throughout Canada, including in Quebec. And the member for Glengarry Prescott Russell will do everything that he can to stand with us to defend French throughout Canada.
Très content que le ministre s'est repris.
Yes, thank you for correcting yourself, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are worried that the right to choose, along with sexual and reproductive health care, are no longer guaranteed. Our government has made critical investments in protecting and strengthening sexual and reproductive rights in Canada. Could the Minister of Women, Gender Equality and Youth update the House on the work our government is doing to support sexual and reproductive health care across this country? Very important.
The Honourable Minister for Gender Equality and Youth.
Speaker, I appreciate the member and the question. Strengthening sexual reproductive health care is essential and to ensure that women can make their own decisions when it comes to their health. It's why we're making contraceptives free to 9 million women across Canada. It's why the menstrual Social Equity Fund was created, which has lifted nearly 3 million people out of period poverty. It's why we invested $45 million into the Sexual and Reproductive Health Fund to organizations providing essential services. Investments like these, Mr. Speaker, are a true step forward to lasting gender equality.
The honourable member from Edmonton Griesbach.
Trinkets and beads, Mr. Speaker. That's what Obsidian Oil, an American company, has been willing to offer the Woodland Cree First Nation. Their drillings have caused earthquakes and polluted the land. Worse yet, now that Treaty 8 First Nations are exercising their treaty rights, the company has called on the RCMP to imprison Woodland Cree leaders. Wow. It's a shameful display of colonial tactics that have plagued Indigenous communities for generations. Will the Liberals uphold the treaty and support the Woodland Cree against this greedy company?
The Honourable Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations.
Mr. Speaker, self-determination over Indigenous land is so critical to our path towards reconciliation. We will be working with the Woodland Cree as well as my colleague opposite towards a resolution to this very important issue, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member from Churchill-Coatineck, Askey.
Mr. Speaker, major wildfires hit early this year here in northern Manitoba because of drought, because of climate change. Thankfully, evacuees in Cranberry Portage and elsewhere are back home. But in addition to thousands of hectares, the fire destroyed fiber optic